Welcome to episode 2 of the Songwriter Select podcast, where a group of songwriters will be talking about music, songwriting, production, and whatever else tickles our fancy. I'm your host, James Nighthawk, and with me are 3 fellow writers. First up, we have Becky Thomas. Are you there, Becky?
I'm here, hello.
Hello, how are you doing, Becky?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm not too bad, thank you very much. And next up we have Anthony Lane. Can you hear me, Anthony?
Loud and clear, James.
Fantastic. You all right?
Yep, top notch. Yourself?
Yep, still good from a few moments ago. And last but not least, Paul Boyd. Are you there, Paul?
Hello, yes.
We have a full house. You good, Paul?
I'm good, very tired.
Very tired, yes. We've been talking about your election week escapades going on there, but glad to see it's all sorted for you now. So, first up, we would like to go back to our first episode and get some feedback, basically, because we've posted online on songwriterforum.co.uk for quite a few people have given some feedback. So, Becky, instead of going at the end, would you like to go at the beginning of the podcast here and hand us some feedback that we've been receiving?
Yeah, great, thank you. We've had some lovely feedback and it's really been great to hear. So thank you to everybody who has got in touch, whether via the thread on the forum or whether via Twitter or comments on YouTube or messages. Thank you for all of them. And we've had some really useful ideas as well. A few people have suggested that we might want to review songs from forum members, and all of us, I think, absolutely agree that that's something that we really would like to do. We'll be looking for volunteers, and it might be that the first time we do that is in the next episode. So, and I think Serious Fun, if you're listening, has potentially already volunteered himself, but we're looking for other volunteers as well. So if you would like that to be something you do, then please do get in touch.
No pressure, of course, if he
No
doesn't
pressure.
want to, but yeah. Great. We did discuss the idea of that a little bit before the podcast started. So the fact that people have jumped onto that idea anyway is great. We do want to go ahead for that. And even if you don't want your song reviewed on the podcast, we are also looking for indent music. So if people want to put their music forward to be played on the podcast, we can also consider that as well. So do get in touch either way there.
Drop me a line if that's something you'd like to have with one of your pieces of music. We're very happy to hear from you. Another suggestion is that a couple of people have suggested that they'd like to come on as guests. And again, that's something that we all would like to have as well. So just have a different voice each week or occasionally. We're definitely keen to have people on and ideas for what you'd like to talk about as well. So again, do get in touch if that's something you'd like to do. Then we've had a few ideas along the lines of, Crystal Susie mentioned that she'd like us to do a video. Not totally convinced by that one, but James was mentioning earlier that he's done a podcast selfie, so that might be something you'll be seeing.
We're going to get 4 selfies tweeted up in the near future, so you can see what we look like whilst we're podcasting. But no, we're not all in the same room. We're spread somewhat across the country, in fact. Hertfordshire, Paul, you're in Kent, is it?
Yeah.
Becky?
Hampshire.
And Anthony?
Devon.
All the way down in South
across
Wales.
the south coast. We need some northerners on.
We do.
Or some people from other countries, indeed.
Yep. But as far as the video goes, maybe down the line when we get to a point of having the chance to get all together in one room. But as stands, it's going to be just selfies on Twitter for now.
If enough people subscribe, we can afford a TV studio. And we'll do it.
Awesome.
Okay, another suggestion that a few people made was that where we have the section on the current songs and the deconstruction of the song, could we perhaps play the song itself? Unfortunately, that's not something we're able to do because of copyright, but we can include links to go and listen to the song, so hopefully that will work for you guys instead.
YouTube is your friend.
Indeed. And then we had a couple of people talk about why or sort of how the forum works for them, and how the podcast has been useful for them in the way they go about their writing of music. And Sarah Parr, I think, sorry if I've mispronounced your name, but mentioned that the forum gives her a lot of motivation to write, and that this podcast was another thing that does that for her. And so having the forum and places like this is kind of a safe place for feedback. And again, when we start reviewing forum members' songs, then we'll give some feedback here, and hopefully that will be considered safe also.
I think a couple of people said something very similar, in fact, and it was nice that our thoughts when we were discussing the community last week were echoed by people on the forum. It was nice to hear that we're not the only ones that have that feeling towards it. So yes, thank you very much for those comments in particular.
Yeah, and Serious Fun, again, going back to you, mentioned that it was good to hear people reinforcing what he called his misguided opinions. So we're happy to also be misguided with you.
I think he said potentially misguided.
And then one other comment was kind of in relation to the discussion we had about the Taylor Swift song last time, and the you versus I discussion. And it was just really nice to see the conversation that we were having on the podcast continuing afterwards. So we want to see more of that.
Definitely.
So yeah, any messages for next time, please do get in touch.
Indeed, you can get Becky at songwriterselect@gmail.com, or you can message her on the forum, or on, what's your Twitter, Becky?
Oh, now you're asking. It's Becky Lucy Music.
There we go. Or just directly to SW Select Podcast. Brilliant. Okay, we're going to plan to do that stuff at the end of the podcast, but for this week, because it was our first, we thought we'd jump straight in and say thank you to everyone who's listening, and it's been a really good uptake straight off there on YouTube. And we are now, as you may well be listening to this, we are now on iTunes, so do make sure you subscribe and tell your friends there. It's probably the easiest way to listen to us each time we upload. So let's move on to now listening. So let's go to Paul first. What have you been listening to? What's been on your stereo recently, Paul?
Yeah, interestingly, I came across, remember Avril Lavigne?
I do know Avril Lavigne, yes.
I was trawling around YouTube and found the making of an album, The Best Damn Thing, from 2007. Which
Okay.
The single you might know was Girlfriend.
Yes, the one that sounded a bit like Hey Mickey.
Yeah.
That's the one.
But the show, there's about a 40-minute video on YouTube of her making it with Dr. Luke in the studio. And the songs are great, but to hear her just, I've got an idea for a vocal, run into the vocal booth, lay it down pretty damn well, and then just come back, and it sounds like a single straight away. Very, very good.
She wouldn't be an obvious choice for listening as far as a songwriting point of view goes. I know her first album she worked with, I think it was The Matrix, the collaboration called The Matrix, not obviously the film, and oddly enough, and because she was packaged by that production group. I don't know what influence she has on the writing herself, so does that give us a bit more insight, that documentary?
Now she's working with Dr. Luke, who's sort of one of the top anyway, but it's very much just in the studio, mucking around, recording, getting drunk a lot, more mucking around. But yeah, really, really good to see how it worked, and yeah, really interesting.
Were you a fan of her music when she's been fairly quiet, at least on the UK scene. Were you a fan of her music back in the day? Disappeared.
Yeah. Skater Boy is a classic.
For those not aware, Paul is our unashamed pop fan here, so we've gone straight into production pop there. I think I've got the first album, Let Go, is it called? That sounds about right.
Yeah.
I remember buying that was around about my university age, and yeah, I remember there being some quite strong pop songs on there. It's quite unashamedly so, with a slightly rockier edge, but it was very clear that it was marketed towards that kind of market there.
But it's the attitude and the delivery of the vocal that really sort of stands her apart from the other acts. I think she gets across the emotion, the attitude, and a lot of similarities with Taylor Swift coming up again.
Yeah.
She's kind of like the love child of Taylor Swift and Alanis Morissette.
It is a good mix. Yeah, it's an interesting pop-punk mix. I really like it.
Fair enough. And anything else on your radar at the moment?
Yeah, well, one I found very recently, a band M.O. M.O.
With a line Frudio, yes?
No.
Oh, okay.
M.O. So a female trio.
Right.
Annie Ashcroft, Frankie Connolly, and Nadeem Samuels. But very, very sort of 90s R&B sound, a bit Janet Jackson-y, real smooth. But yeah, really, really good. Only just found them, so check them out.
Active from 2012, Google is telling me. So very much a new one.
And a single of Preach is the one that we listen to. And there's some fantastic covers on YouTube of just the three of them with a guy in the background with a guitar. But really, really enjoyed that.
These artists don't make it easy to find them, because I have just Googled M.O, and I found them, but directly underneath it is the one I was talking about, which is the M.O with the line through it. And
if you search for the album, well, I don't think the album's out yet. I think they've released a single, Preach, which when I watched it, I thought it was Breathe, the pronunciation. What was Preach? But yeah, so I'm looking forward to that album.
Some deep cuts there from bands we've not heard of. I like it.
How did you discover them, Boydie?
I think they were on a show on the telly, just like a snippet, very short. I can't remember the show, but just a really short snippet. I thought, oh, that sounded really good, and found them on YouTube.
Brilliant. Wasn't that similar to what you had last week, Becky, with Bombay Bicycle Club? That you heard a track somewhere and dived in to find them?
I think I was already aware of them prior to finding them, but I think I was just on a bit of a wander around YouTube, as I do occasionally.
Pull down the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
I like it.
Great. Paul, anything else to add?
Yeah, no, they were the main ones. And then obviously Uptown Funk from later on.
We will get to later on. Great. Okay. Anthony, what have you been listening to?
I'm not ashamed to say this, James. I've been listening to the mixes I got back for my new album.
Go for it.
Mostly.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm going to save talking about that because I'll have hopefully a wee opportunity when the thing's actually out.
Indeed. I saw a tweet online. You were in mixing hell. Did you say that your album would be stuck in mixing hell or something?
I said my epitaph will read, "Here lies Anthony Lane. He was one mix short of an album."
Okay, there we go.
So I hope that doesn't come out to be true. It probably won't. So yeah, when I haven't been indulging my ego to a ridiculously obscene extent, I've been listening to Everyday Robots by Damon Albarn, which if you haven't listened to, then you really, really must, even if you're not big on Blur or Gorillaz, because it's really fab.
Is it similar to either of those?
Only in as much as you can't really take Damon Albarn out of either of those acts and still have the same music. But it feels a bit more songwritery to me. It's kind of it's more in my corner of the room, for want of a better expression.
Gotcha.
Everything I like about him without some of the things I didn't like about his other projects.
Well, interestingly, I do want to jump onto the new Blur album. I haven't had a chance this week, but I'm intrigued as to how the new Blur album's coming together.
I love what I've heard.
I've heard some very good things. In fact, what I've heard is it's a lot of the good parts of Blur without some of the harder to get into aspects. But with Graham Coxon still doing his bizarre guitar lines, which are often very intriguing work he does there. So this album, how long has it been out? It's because obviously they're currently promoting their Blur things. This must be at least a year or so old.
I don't even think it's that old. I seem to have roughly become aware of it around sort of October, November last year. So I don't know if it had been out for a while, but they were advertising on TV for a while. I don't think it's that old.
Okay. Brilliant. Okay, but glad to hear you're enjoying that.
Indeed.
Was there anything else, or have obviously been focusing on your own music? And I know exactly what that's like. Sometimes it's hard to expand your horizons when you're focusing inwardly there.
It is. I will just quickly jump in. There's a new-ish record by Ray LaMontagne called Supernova, which is kind of wild away from what you're used to from him, but also superb.
I know it well, yes.
Yes, he's taken a kind of psychedelic.
Yeah, but it still has some
sound.
good, strong melodies in there, though, which...
Very good songwriting in there.
Yeah.
I'm
Did you
really
hear the
a big
album
fan.
before, the darker one? I forget what it's called, but it had a very black cover, and it started on a very slow seeping
Yeah.
song.
Is it
And
Till the Sun Turns Black?
that's the one. And I didn't take to that album because I so loved his first one with Trouble. Oh, I don't know if it was. I think it was his first one.
I think that was his first one.
It was
Yeah.
definitely the one that broke him, the one with Trouble and Hold You in My Arms, etc. And that was, in a way, kind of the joyous parts of Van Morrison, but with a different voice. And then that second album was quite dark and quite foreboding. So I'm also a big fan of Supernova. Good car listening, I find.
Excellent. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, sure. I'll just move on. I'll leave Becky till last because you've got somewhere interesting to go with your conversation there, Becky. So I'll go next. Right, what have I been listening to? I got through the post some actual CDs. I still buy those things. I got the first two Tori Amos albums have been remastered from the early 90s. Little Earthquakes and Under the Pink. Do we have any Tori Amos fans on the podcast here?
Of course.
Not really.
Oh, okay. That's one yes. Anthony?
An appreciator more than a fan.
Okay, fair enough. I knew these albums from the late 90s. I found her towards the end of the decade there, and I went back to Little Earthquakes, and I found Tori Amos before I found Joni Mitchell, so that's probably why I enjoy her more than perhaps I would, because I think if you find it the other way round, I've had some people say that they don't quite get into it as much because there's a lot of aping going on there. That aside, the remasters, absolutely fantastic. Obviously, doing what I do as a producer, I'm quite skeptical and I do pick these things apart, but the original of Little Earthquakes was done on quite a small budget, and having it come through on your headphones clean as a whistle is just they've done a really good job. A lot of the instruments that were quiet in the mix have come forward. It's probably closest to a remix than a remaster in places, but very much to the benefit of the song. So those of you out there listening that do like Tori Amos, I do suggest you either jump on the CDs, or I think the new remasters on Spotify now. It's not quite
nothing re-recorded then?
No, it's grabbing the source files, which I assume were tape, and just remastering them. So obviously better compressors, better leveling, etc. And they just sound a lot crisper. There's very few examples of what can happen with remasters where the things you don't want to hear are brought forward. I noticed on Under the Pink there was a stereo jump where a sound was on one side of the speaker and it moved very quickly to the other, as if the panner had just been jerked rather than smoothly moved, and that was a bit odd on headphones. But generally the sounds are holding up really well, which makes me wonder whether they just didn't have the mixing budget the first time round, because obviously she was, until I think wasn't it Cornflake Girl that broke her as far as a radio artist is concerned. But if you don't know those albums, they hold up fantastically well, and they are probably the two strongest from the songwriting point of view. I don't think she's bettered them, but I still enjoy her work going forward. So they're definitely on my... does anyone know those albums at all?
Yeah, I do quite well. Although it's been a while since I listened to them repeatedly over and over and over and over and over again.
Okay, so you did at one point then?
I did, yeah.
Yes.
I did. And I was just going to say, because you sparked a thought, and I was almost going to say in the last podcast when we were talking about, or you were talking about Laura Marling and the kind of talky, singy song. And Tori does quite a lot of that, and I think she does it brilliantly.
There's something very engaging about Tori's voice. She can grab an audience. She's got a fan base in a similar way to a lot of these female singer-songwriters do, that are very, very strong and very engaged in her work. And there's something about she's always very clear in the mix, and you can always pick out the words and her meaning, which is so vital for a singer-songwriter like that. And she's also got that very bare lyricism that Joni Mitchell and Janis Joplin, etc., had, where it was she just said exactly what she wanted to without self-censoring too much. So that's something that also tends to be very engaging to writers. I always tend to grab onto those rather than people hiding behind too many metaphors. So So that's my now listening. Next up, Mumford & Sons. Obviously, they've got a new disc out, which has been causing quite a bit of conversation on social networks.
Yep.
Who here has heard any of their newer stuff?
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah,
Yep.
just the single, really. The Believe. is it
Believe,
called?
yep.
Yeah.
And they had the
Yeah, just
second
a
one, The
single.
Wolf, as well. I went back to the first album because I love it, and it was just a case of doing a nice comparison there. And when it was mentioned they were dropping the banjos and bringing out the Stratocasters, I wasn't concerned. I don't mind that. A lot of people are in uproar. For me, the instruments you use are a tool for making music, and as long as they do it well, I don't really mind what is their acts of choice at the time. So that hasn't concerned me. The new album I've listened to probably about 3 times now all the way through, and it's definitely a grower. I'm enjoying it more with each listen. The single is good. I think there's some stronger melodies on the back end of the album, so that means it's got some legs for it there. And yeah, I actually quite like it. I probably enjoy it more than the second album. Is it Babel or Babel? I think it's Babel, isn't it?
Babel.
Yeah,
Yeah. On the thing of them kind of going electric, as it were, I sort of think they ought to have done that with the second album, because the second album was basically the cast-offs from the first album.
You're about the third person to say that to me this week, speaking at the studio when I've been listening to it. The second album is very pleasant, but I couldn't hum you a single song other than I Will Wait off of it, just because that was played a lot on the radio. It was a case of, let's do another album of the same style.
Yeah.
So changing the sonic options they've got was no bad thing there. I do think that they are lacking in upfront melodies, but then I double guessed myself there, because I went back and thought the first album, it's not like it's a hook-laden album. It's not pop music. So maybe I took my time to love the first album, and I just need to do the same with this third album. So I'm not going to dock them any points there. And that song Believe does have a good, strong radio hook up front there.
It does.
The only criticism I do have is it does sound a little bit like they've spent a bit too much time in the studio layering upwards and upwards, and occasionally the songs get a bit dense, and when the guitars hit in, it's a bit too much of a wall of sound going on. And one of the things that I really like about the early Mumford stuff is that it's very open, and the production's very clear and not overstuffed at any point.
That was the first thing I noticed about it. Was I was expecting to hear something with lots of space in it, but it was a bit claustrophobic, and I couldn't pick out what I wanted to pick out.
It is not car listening, because the first time I listened was in the car, and you add some road noise to that, and the melodies just get lost, and they haven't mixed the vocals quite as loudly as I would want them to. So on good headphones, it sounds great, but they're very much going for the arty rather than the radio angle there. So I'd say it's definitely more of a grower than it is a upfront record. But what is good is that when they mentioned they were changing their sound, I was concerned they were going to lose the intimacy they have, because one of the things that everyone loves about the early record is that the poetry is up front. Whether or not it's to your liking is just a personal preference there, but the nice melody lines and the nice words are there, and they're clear, and you can just pick them out. And I do feel that maybe that's pushed back a little bit here, so you've got to spend some time with it. But yeah, it's definitely a good record. I'm enjoying it. Probably more than I thought I would.
Interestingly, they've just knocked Blur off the top spot in the UK album chart.
How
Very interesting.
Was that 2 weeks? So Blur were last week and Mumford are this week, is it?
Yeah, 51 minutes ago.
Oh yes, we are recording on Sunday evening there. Fresh
You're
off
so on the button.
There
Boyd.
we go.
81,300 sales. Chart sales.
Is it me, or does that not sound like a lot?
But it's chart sales, so I don't know if do they extrapolate? I'd have to check.
I do know they take streaming into account now, but I don't know how it works. It's a bit of a convoluted system they've got going on. Yeah, and lastly, my last now listening is a continuation of last week and also leads into Becky. I went to see Laura Marling at the South Bank Centre in London. So I got to see her new tour. I have to apologise to Anthony here, who was also lined up to see this tour and couldn't due to a horrendous bout of man flu.
Just the most
and
serious flu there is.
It was
Of course.
life-threatening. Yeah.
Becky, you have no idea. Whereas, Becky, you got tickets last minute without expecting them.
I did, yeah, completely unexpected. Just somebody else, a friend of a friend who couldn't use the tickets, and I got to go unexpectedly, which was great.
Well, there we go.
And that was in Southampton Guildhall. So yeah, I mean, obviously, well, not obviously, but it was mostly, as far as I know, it was mostly new album stuff, which I'm not so familiar with yet. But the tracks that she played that are amongst my favourites are obviously Rambling Man and Sophia, and What He Wrote, which I absolutely love. I think it's a really beautiful song.
Yep.
And the new album stuff was all really fantastic as well, and she is such an amazing performer.
Oh, you've got a glowing review then here. Is this your first time seeing her live?
It is, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. And would you go again?
Oh, for sure, yeah. The Southampton Guildhall's a bit of a funny venue because it's kind of a big cavernous box, and the acoustics aren't the best. But yeah, her performance was fantastic.
Great. I've seen her, this will be the third time I've seen her now, and I did thoroughly enjoy the performance, but I'd actually say of the 3 times I've seen it, it was probably my least favourite, actually. Least favourite of three very good gigs. We had this discussion, I think offline, not on the podcast, but I do feel that she's going through a strange transition, moving to more electric instruments. And at times that meant that I wasn't quite into the song as much as I wanted to be. And she also, some of the arrangements were a little bit, it's hard to explain. I mean, I felt the same about the album the first few times, in all fairness, which is now subsiding. It felt like the song was pushed back behind the guitars a bit more than I would like, which is such a stark contrast to her early music there. And the other thing, Anthony, how many times have you seen her live? You've definitely seen her before.
That was
you
my
haven't.
first time.
Oh, sorry. Just rubbing that in there. Just the knife in and twisting it there. She's been on the circuit. She's up to her 5th album. Is this?
Sounds about right.
And she still seems incredibly shy on stage, and she doesn't engage with the audience. She got a mumbled "How are you?" and that was pretty much it. And it's a little bit of me wants to say, this is your job. This is your job, Laura. You should have been better at this by now. But that's just something that I like out of a gig. I like audience engagement. I like to think that you're part of what's going on there, and that the artist will bring you in a little bit. So that made me feel a little bit uncomfortable that she's still doing the awkward girl on stage thing. But that is just me. I know a lot of people find that endearing, and she's
maybe
artistic,
that's her brand.
etc. I mean, I'm not expecting her to start cracking one-liners. That would be rather contrasting to her music. It needs to have that artistic and solemn edge there. But yeah, she just, there's something a little bit more uncomfortable about this gig than the others. But
more uncomfortable.
Yeah, maybe
her being less comfortable on the stage.
Maybe because of the mixes of the songs and the electric instruments coming in, that was compounding it for me. I don't know whether it was in line or just as well as type thing. But when it's just, I mean, I've seen her play when it's just her and a guitar, no guitar changes, and it's just an hour long of just guitar music, and she seems more comfortable there. Whereas with this one, she was switching guitars around between songs, and the band were moving around, and maybe that's the newness which isn't quite gelling for her. But that aside, I was
just going to say, I hadn't seen her previously with the more simple setup, so that didn't really enter my head, and I really enjoyed the show. But obviously the kind of the shyness with the audience, I mean, I don't have a problem with that, and I don't, as a singer and songwriter, that's not really the main thing of her job, is it? I don't think.
No, but I do see quite a few singer-songwriters who are the opposite and will natter between songs. And I am, if I were to choose a camp, I prefer that. I prefer a break, an anecdote, something about the song, maybe a gentle joke, just so you can feel like you're not just there to see a human jukebox. And I mean, that's sounds horrible, and I don't mean that. I'm going to see Laura Moore, and I do enjoy her live. It's just I prefer a little engagement from an artist on stage, and she doesn't do that. But if she did it badly, that would also be worse. So if it's not something she can do, then fair enough, basically. Okay, and so Becky, obviously that's a little bit talk about the Laura Marling gig you've been listening to, but on your now listening, you're going to go somewhere different with this, aren't you? So take it away.
Yeah. Well, I think a few people who will be listening to this already know, because I've mentioned it before, is that I went away on a songwriters retreat this a couple of weeks ago in Estonia, for all random places. Although now I've been there and met lots of people from there, it's not random anymore. It's a wonderful place. The retreat was really quite a sort of a transforming experience, really. It was a week long, and they kind of call it community through songwriting, and that's exactly what it is. It's all about co-writing, and it's also all about kind of it sounds really kind of mumbo jumbo, but it's all about connecting with your own body and spirit. So they have a kind of a yoga type session each morning, and then they have a listening session where each person in the group gets to speak about anything they want to speak about for 2 minutes, and everyone else just listens. And that's sounds not that weird, but when you actually do it, it's a very weird experience. And I found it quite uncomfortable to start with, and I actually have to confess I had a little weep the second time I had to do it. It was quite embarrassing, but from then on, it helped the group to gel and work together and understand each other, and it was really amazing, actually.
Is it a breaking down boundaries type thing?
That type of thing, yeah, that type of thing. And it's very hard to explain, but I think quite a few of the people on the retreat before the week was out had a little cry in front of everyone, so I didn't feel like I was the only weirdo by the end.
How many in the group, Becky?
There are about a dozen of us probably on the retreat, and then about 2 or 3 people leading it. And most of them were from Sweden, Estonia, Ukraine, Denmark, and then just me from the UK. And so as I said, it was all about co-writing. So each day you were partnered with a different person and given a different they called it a jumping off point to go off and write a song. And so for 5 days in a row, I co-wrote a new song, which is something that was absolutely new to me, and really gave me a real sort of sense of pride for doing it and coming up with things that I felt proud of every day. So yeah, it was brilliant. I really loved it, and I totally recommend it to anybody.
Fantastic. First question, I assume the lingua franca was English?
Well, the communicating language was English, and
Good.
Everyone spoke English to a pretty good standard. But part of the point of the retreat was that they wanted people to write in their native languages. So when it came to songwriting, that certainly wasn't all in English. There was a lot of Swedish, Estonian, a little bit of Norwegian, Danish, some Russian, some Ukrainian. So yeah, I sang in Swedish and Estonian, which was also new and probably not to be repeated.
I would like to hear it, but
yeah, me too.
How did you hear about this?
So about this time last year, I'd kind of decided I wanted to go on a songwriting holiday, and I found a different one, which I went on last summer in France, and I came away from that having loved it. It was a completely different experience, but I also loved it in its own way. And I just kind of decided I knew I wanted to do more of the same. And when I'd been searching I just basically Googled songwriting holidays or songwriting retreats or something. And I'd found a few different options, and this was one of them. So, and the person who runs them runs several of them in different remote locations around Europe and America.
Sounds fascinating. And did you find it at all stressful, or was it? I mean, you mentioned you had a little bit of a cry at one point.
Yeah, that was quite stressful.
Obviously, anything that puts you in an artistic situation isn't going to be entirely relaxing. But did you find that by the end of it, you were getting a relaxation out of it, or was it entirely putting you on edge and keeping you on your toes throughout the period?
It was very exhausting because you kind of you start the day with nothing, and by the end of the day you're going to have to have created something, and that's quite a daunting thought. And so by the end of the day, you feel quite exhausted by it, knowing that you're going to do exactly the same again the next day. So by the end of the week, you feel completely just zonked. But I think the first day I found not stressful, but it felt like pressure rather than relaxing and enjoyment. Because I'd never done it before, and it was kind of like, we have to write a song. I don't know what we're going to write about. And it was just really hard. But then each day that went by, it just got more and more fun, more and more relaxing. We all knew each other better as we went through the week, so it became easier to communicate. It was brilliant. It wasn't a holiday because I came back exhausted, but it was brilliant.
A change is as good as a rest, they say,
Yeah.
Becky.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome to hear about there. I was intrigued when you mentioned it last week before you headed out. And yeah, sounds like a fascinating way to spend time off work. So
Yeah.
And you'd recommend it onwards for other people?
I certainly would. Yeah, I certainly would. You have to go with an open mind because it's definitely a new way of doing things. But I got so much out of it.
Did you record any? Sorry, Danny. Did you record any of the songs?
Just kind of on one take recordings, mainly kind of when we were practicing. We did have a concert at the end of the week where about 20 of the songs that we'd between us written during the week we performed. And I'm not sure whether that got recorded, but yeah, when we were doing our rehearsing, I was recording on the iPad, so I can share those with people.
Yeah, cool.
If they're interested.
Right. And does it change the way you write from here on?
I haven't written anything else yet, so I'll tell you later.
Oh, okay.
But it has it opened your eyes to different ways that you could write?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, kind of, I think because you're put into these co-writing situations, you can't just do what you would normally do. You have to find a way to work with that person. So they provide you with an idea of how to get started on writing the song, and they kind of focus it on either lyrics or on melody or on rhythm, and it's just different ways of approaching each of those things, and then the rest follows. So yeah, it's really good.
Well, that was brilliant to hear about. So thank you for sharing that with us there, Becky. Right, I think it's a good time to take a break here. So we're just going to stop recording for a moment. For those of you listening on podcast, obviously we'll be back very shortly, but see you in a moment. And for this week's musical interlude, we will be listening to a snippet from one of my songs. This is James Nighthawk, the track Jenny, which you can hear in full at soundcloud.com/James Nighthawk, or you can find on iTunes and all other vendors.
Sometimes it's never clear till it's too late. And as she drove away that night, yeah, she knows she'll be alright. She just smiled. For loving sure ain't easy, but loving's half the battle, so let's try. To be fair, all the time. To be fair, yeah, tonight.
And we're back. Hello there. So moving on, we are going to go to the news for the last few weeks. So I'll hand you over to our news correspondent, Anthony. What have you got for us, Anthony?
Okay, 3 fairly interesting developments. I'm going to kick off with SoundCloud, which is a resource that quite a lot of songwriters find really useful, not just as a way of getting the songs heard, but as a community. Going through some fairly turbulent times, some quite well-known writers have removed their music from the service. Most noticeably, Aphex Twin, who I think is called Richard D. James in real life, has taken about 200 tracks off, and most of Sony, if not all of their roster, have taken down original recordings. That's from people including Adele, Hosier, Kelly Clarkson, and some other folks. And nobody's coming out front and saying exactly, I'm taking it off because XYZ, but word on the street seems to be lack of monetization opportunities. So make of that what you will.
Well, SoundCloud was never about monetization. It was always about getting your song there, uploaded to your fans immediately, and the ease of what it does. It's very much the YouTube of sound. So that's an odd one. And a question for you, Anthony. Was it Aphex Twin who, not too long ago, put his whole catalogue on SoundCloud?
Yes, and he's deleted his account.
Right. So that was... I didn't misremember there. That is a full about face there. At one point, he went for everyone have it, enjoy it in your own time, to no, I'm taking it back.
I wonder if what's happened is, because I've noticed this, and if you've got stuff on SoundCloud, you should check. There are some websites that will scrape all your SoundCloud content, host it on another site, and make it available for download, even if you haven't enabled download on your SoundCloud account. So I'm wondering if...
Well, that sucks.
Yeah, I mean, I'm wondering if people are getting wind of this and thinking, well, if I'm not in control of this, then I can't trust SoundCloud with it.
That is a fascinating point. I mean, we do live in an age of streaming now where Spotify, etc. exists, but at least there is a small degree of monetization there, whereas SoundCloud doesn't earn artists a penny. We can all attest to that. We all put our music on SoundCloud and it doesn't earn us anything. There is no monetization from advertising or PRS or any kind of streaming benefits there, no matter whether you pay them or whether you have a free account. So yeah, something to keep an eye on there, definitely. I mean, for the little guys like us, probably not a concern about the scraping, but definitely for the major artists. But having said that, didn't we go through a period with Napster, etc., a decade ago where that was kind of killed anyway by iTunes making it legitimate anyway? And if people want to nick your music, they're going to find a way. So it's an interesting one. We'll keep an ear open to it.
I'll share your view, James. I never saw it as a pro thing for established recorded artists or signed artists to use. I always saw it as like for the up-and-coming, reaching fans, sharing music.
Or for the existing artists putting up kind of deep cuts, remixes, or studio demos as a let's get it on SoundCloud now, post it to Facebook just so we can share something, an audio version of Twitter, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Not here's my new single, put it on SoundCloud, because they've got better ways of making money from that. It goes on iTunes and Spotify, not SoundCloud there. Okay, and next up, Anthony.
Okay, next up, a bunch of big brains over at Queen Mary and Imperial College in London have been studying pop music over the decades and have decided that the Beatles did not revolutionize pop and rock music. Apparently, similar progressions, melodies, rhythms, colors, whatever, lyrical subjects have been kind of continuous throughout history. In fact, the only thing they can categorically say, according to their research, that did revolutionize pop music was hip hop. So what do you think of that?
Paul, jump in.
Well, this,
pop brain.
It's the old, Van Gogh used paint, so did Picasso. None of them invented paint, none of them invented blue, none of them invented orange, but it's how it's used, and people copied those styles. So I agree with the sort of academic approach, but I'm sure we all hear tunes and say, oh yeah, that was influenced by the Beatles or any other band.
I agree. I think they kind of invented indie in a way. It's like it was the norm for artists to have their songs written for them prior to the Beatles era. after which it kind of became the norm for, instrument playing bands to pen their own material.
That was a major sea change they brought. Yes, I mean, in the early Beatles albums, it was roughly a 50-50 on stuff like Please Please Me. And even that was quite brave. It was a case of putting songs that no one had heard of, to make them be the ambassadors for those songs. And then as the albums went through to the middle of the 60s, it got to a point of only one or two covers. And then obviously the second half of their career, it was their stuff. And that was the sea change there. But equally, as well as not just the fact they were writing their own stuff, they would take influences left, right, and centre, and that's maybe the big thing that the Beatles did for me. It's not, whereas before artists would be, I'm a soul artist, I'm a blues artist, and they played soul and they played blues. The Beatles would very much be a case of, I like this record, so I'm going to put in some sitar. I like this record, so I'm going to do a heavy rock track. And they would be far more, their catalogue is wide ranging. In seven and a half years, they did coming on to 300 songs, and they didn't duplicate themselves at any point. They didn't get samey at any point. And that kind of amalgamation of their influences is perhaps their biggest influence going forward, showing that you can have a wide spectrum of influences and still be a coherent band. But
Agreed.
That is the kind of, as you mentioned with the paint metaphor there, Paul, that is kind of the postmodernist view of everything's been done. It's just how we then do it differently. So, yeah, I think... I also think, does it matter? Is the thing I take away from that. What was this study started for?
Its own sake, from what I gather. And I agree, what does it matter? I just thought, being that we're going to be talking about deconstructing songs a bit later on in the podcast and looking at statistics and, what works from a commercial, from a CEO's point of view, this study seemed to be saying that you can't make the Beatles revolutionary from the stats. So I wondered, maybe that relates in some way to what we're all going to be looking at a bit later.
It does. And the other thing that was revolutionary about the Beatles and that time in the 60s was a revolution in social climate. It was a case...
Exactly.
The 60s just did something different to, firstly, Britain, and then by extension, the world around it. It was an amazing time for Britain as the hub of the world there, and the swinging 60s and the changes in attitudes towards feminism and attitudes towards so many parts of culture. And it just was an eye-opening period where things could be different and things could change, and a lot happened over that period. And having that group at the fore, that's probably where a lot of the thoughts of where the Beatles revolutionising pop music, because pop music isn't just the songs, and obviously the Beatles were a great example of that. They started off as the mop tops and the pin-ups, and then by the end they were the hippies with the long hair and the attitude. Yeah. They changed their own influences, let alone the way it influenced the world around them. So I think
the way they explored putting their music into different media as well was really not necessarily revolutionary, but fairly new and influential, I suppose.
And we all love the Beatles movies.
Yeah, exactly.
Fantastic pieces of art there.
Maybe it shines a light on how songwriters experience music differently, because as a songwriter you can't listen to the Beatles without all your songwriting neurons firing like mad, and you're thinking, oh my god, this key change or that chord change or this melodic shift or that interval or whatever kind of jumps out and hits you across the head with these songs. But for Joe Public, they're just great 60s pop music.
Yeah, we probably are listening to this in a different kind of vacuum to the non-writers, and obviously people listening to this podcast are largely going to be other musicians and songwriters. But yeah, you're right. For me, it's a case of the number of amazing changes they managed to get into songs and still managed to cut them to 2.5 minutes is something that we should all take away and realise that 5 minutes of 2 chords maybe is pushing it, unless you've got some very interesting hook beyond that.
Yeah, Horse with No Name, I think, is the one that springs to mind.
Right.
Sorry, that was totally lost on you, wasn't it?
That was I was
Silence.
waiting for someone else to jump in on that, but no.
All right, well, I'll move on to item number 3
Let's
then.
go for it.
Okay, well, just when you thought it was safe to go out and release a record after the Blurred Lines fiasco, along comes Uptown Funk with its own copyright lawsuit. And turns out a part of the song is too similar to Oops Upside Your Head by the Gap Band, and they've been forced to add 5 more writers to the credits.
Bringing it to 11, if I remember
11.
correctly.
Yep.
So we all know the part of the song that we're talking about, yes? It's the Uptown Funk You Up.
Uptown Funk You Up.
Yes.
Yep.
Which is just a change of the words to Oops Upside Your Head. Correct?
Oops Upside Your Head.
Thank you for the call and response there, Paul. It was beautiful. Yeah, I spotted it when it came out. And this leads to an interesting discussion. A while ago on the forum, I posted something in the resources or the writing thread asking people's opinion of the following. I was writing a song and I had a melody line, and I realised that Psycho Killer Qu'est-ce que c'est kind of fitted really nicely with the thing I'd written as a counterpoint. And I was considering dropping that in on the final chorus as a nudge and a wink. And pretty much everyone said, don't do that because you might get in trouble. And are we now at a time where a cheeky reference in a song is now a step too far? Is that where we are? Is that where we stand, Anthony?
Well, it kind of looks like it, doesn't it? Because this doesn't conform to any melodic or lyrical transgression, which traditionally is where your copyright lawsuit comes from. So it definitely feels like the tide is coming in on
Well,
people.
it's melodic though, isn't it?
Well, is it melodic? It sounds spoken to me.
No, it's 2 notes at least.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah, it's not just a single note.
No, there's.
All right, do we derive notes from kind of vocal speaking inflections here? Is that what I'm missing?
Technically, yes. And I think that's the reference point here.
It's nitpicky as hell, though, isn't it?
Mhm.
I'm not disagreeing. And I also think that Becky, you mentioned a short while ago that on the podcast, we were talking before we recorded this about fair usage of songs, and could we put just maybe a 15-second clip of a song under fair usage of copyright? And I think that's something we can do. I haven't looked into it because I wanted to stay away from that. But under the same light, I think there'd be a fair usage of if you were dropping in a reference to an existing song, just to get away with it. But I had an example, and then I realised that when I looked it up, that actually it didn't comply at all. On Oasis, What's the Story, Morning Glory, the opening track, Hello, then they drop in I think it's a Gary Glitter call response. It's good to be back, it's good to be back. Was that Gary Glitter?
Yeah.
And I looked on the credits, and yep, he is credited for it, even though it's only done once or twice as a kind of cheeky nudge and a wink. So yeah, it seems that if you are going to reference someone else's song or do even I'd like to think that a referential lift could be something that an artist would turn around and go, oh, cheers for that. It doesn't hurt me at all, and you're
I suppose the publisher's going to listen to it and think, my client's idea is helping this record to sell.
But it's not like that part of the song is a fundamental, like the fundamental hook. It's not like it's the upfront bit that everyone is going to grab to. It's more of a back
But it is
end.
one of them. It is one of them.
Do you think it's one of the stronger ones there, Paul?
Well, no, it is one of them. Doesn't matter whether it was strong for Oops Upside Your Head. It was pretty much the whole song. So it obviously worked for that. So yeah, it works for that. I'll chuck it in mine and it'll work for that as well. So there has to be a line.
And the publishers see pound signs, dollar signs.
Yeah, of course.
So
Paul, do you think this is a fair judgment?
Well, it's really interesting because I was at a gig a couple of weeks ago and Uptown Funk came on and that section came on and we were talking as a band thinking, oh yeah, we've got to cover this and we'll link it to Oops Upside Your Head at that part and run them into each other.
Okay.
Not even thinking that it had been lifted as, or it could be a copyright issue between the two.
well,
I was
shall we?
surprised.
Well, we can continue with this song because we're going to move on to our next section now, our anatomy of a song, which we'd like to make a weekly part of the podcast. A regular part of the podcast. At this part of the show, we'd like to grab a current chart song and we'd like to look into it and work out why it works and what's going on in the song. Last week, we had an interesting discussion about Taylor Swift Shake It Off, and part of that discussion was then continued on the Songwriter forum. So thank you to everyone who jumped in regarding that. This week we are going to go with Uptown Funk, so we're going to carry on this conversation. Firstly, I would like to mention we have a new resource that's come on board, our new friends over at Hit Songs Deconstructed. So Paul, if you can just very briefly mention a little bit about this website and what it does, and then move us into the deconstruction of Uptown Funk, please.
Yeah, hitsongsdeconstructed.com is a website and a body utilised by songwriters, producers and music industry professionals. And what they do is that, as it says on the tin, they deconstruct current chart songs to find out what makes them tick, and to understand the crafts and the trends that are happening. And they also do sort of industry analysis, so how many of the top 10 songs in the last quarter were sung by males, how quickly did the chorus come in the songs. So the idea is to use that intelligence, for want of a better word, to improve writing for A&R and music industry bodies going forward to land that next hit. So some very in-depth stuff.
I think it's also worth mentioning that when you say deconstruct, you shouldn't underestimate the level of detail that these reports go into. I mean, you could probably print it off and wallpaper a small wall with some of the detail that they go into. There's just as much information really as you could hope to find out about a record. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they do offer some sample reports on the website if you want to have a look.
All I'll say is never has Control F been so useful on my laptop. Yes, there's a lot to find there, and if you wanted to read the whole lot, you would be there for some time. But as you say, Anthony, if you are looking for, I wonder this about the song: when does the chorus start, or how long is the chorus compared to the bridge in this song, etc. You can just Control F it, and it will find a whole bunch of responses for pretty much any question you could ask. So they go into some detail, definitely.
And chart it out as well, which is
going to be very interesting for this feature of our show. Going forward, we're going to pick songs that they have they've gone for as well. So we're going to have our analysis alongside the more figure-based analysis that they've been using. So yes, take us away with Uptown Funk. Okay,
well if you haven't heard it, I'm sure there's a means that you can online. YouTube is your friend.
YouTube, Spotify, etc. All good.
So it's obviously Mark Ronson and a Bruno Mars collaboration. It's the lead single from Mark Ronson's new album, Uptown Special. And obviously it's hit number one on over 30 charts throughout the world. I think the first thing everyone notices from the song that it's a real throwback. It's got a real late 70s, early 80s funk vibe to it, which would normally come across as maybe a bit dated, but I think it's that mix of the retro feel but with real modern sounds. I think that sort of stops it slipping into a pastiche or a period study. It really does come through as a modern feel.
I think he chose a very good vocalist for it in that regard, because Bruno Mars has that soul edge but with a pop sensibility on top of it. So
I was just going to say, I think he's 50% responsible for it sounding as current as it does.
Yeah, and the guys and the band as well.
I mean, the drum sounds used, obviously, they've got an organic background, but they are processed and they are upfront and they are crisp and they are modern. There is no hiding the fact that this is a record of 2015 with references to the 70s, as opposed to one that's just been found in the vault.
Yeah, no, completely. Tempo slightly slower in comparison to the rest of the charts nowadays. It comes in at 115 BPM. I think we were up at 127 from memory last week with Taylor Swift.
Yep.
So a slightly slower track. Some of the stats that we can get out. Well,
on that tempo there, do you think part of the reason it still works as a as a danceable track is that it's got a lot going on within each bar. The actual rhythmic content isn't just a case of how heavy is that bass drum hitting. It's a case of there's some interesting funky movements during each of the drum breaks, and it changes around. It keeps the groove going in that old school funk way.
Yeah, completely.
Cool. You were moving on to some stats there for us there.
Yeah. No, so I was just going to say the first chorus appears after 50 seconds. I say chorus, I'll put big inverted commas around that, because what is the chorus in this song? Because I reckon it's about 3 or 4 contenders.
It's most of the song, in my opinion.
It is. It's chorus, 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 chorus.
Yeah.
If you look at structure. So I found that quite an interesting. Of course, funk traditionally doesn't have a chorus type structure. That's the roots of funk. It's a groove. It's not a structured song as such.
Would anyone agree that the chorus drop after the Uptown Funk "Gonna Give It to Ya," which repeats over and over, and it drops into the horn line, into the trumpet line?
Yeah, but don't believe it, just watch.
Yeah, don't believe it, just watch. And then what's interesting about the chorus is it opens on an instrument rather than a vocal. And seeing, if you're at the bars and you see this song played on a Friday, Saturday night, it's one of those melody lines that even though it's not on the vocal, people start singing da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, and that's the bit, the hummable bit, or the singable bit almost, isn't necessarily the vocal, it's the instruments around it. And
yes and no.
Okay.
I find the verse incredibly singable. I love that the fact that it's got an instrumental segment is one of the things that really drew me into the track early on. But yeah, I don't know. For me, it's the verse. It's that initial, when he opens his mouth for the first time, the melody that comes out is what kind of pins me into the song from there to the end.
Well, interestingly, in an interview when they were writing it, they came up with those first couple of lines and the melody, and from that moment knew it was nailed before they'd done the rest of it.
So I'm onto something here.
Yeah.
Which lines were you saying there?
The opening lines.
The lyric lines.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the melody with it.
So it's 50 seconds, which is actually some time before the first chorus hits, in inverted commas. But how soon after track opening do we have a vocal? Do we have a grab point? I think that's very soon after. I'm trying to remember it.
But it's straight away. I think the intro length is 17 seconds. And of course, it's that famous intro. Just a pitch shifted vocal doing that bass line.
I hadn't spotted that, but...
And don't forget that really classy guitar riff as well that comes in with it just before the vocal comes in.
Yeah. And again, talking to guitar riffs, pretty much 2 chords. I think exclusively 2 chords through the whole track.
I didn't hear a third, no.
Yeah. So it's very simple from that point of view, but of course everything else going on certainly fills some gaps.
I happen to have an acoustic singer in my studio 2 weeks ago, and he was doing a portfolio for his gigging, and one of the tracks he did was an acoustic version of Uptown Funk. And when I saw the list for the day's recording, I was wondering how the hell he was going to make a song with 1, maybe 2 chords work on acoustic. And what he does is he takes the riff line off the bass, and sometimes off the bass or the brass, and kind of riffs around that on the acoustic, and kind of changes it around and focusing on the vocal line, which is not too dissimilar to how I imagine they wrote it, in fact. So as another side point, I can imagine this would be quite a good song for loop pedal artists out there for a very similar reason. So I might have a look at that myself at some point and see if there's some way of looping.
Good idea.
Because as you say, there's not much changing in the background. If you get the rhythmic part going down, you can then focus on the many vocal hooks that will bring the audience in. So that's one thing that came to mind when I was listening to it. But on the point of hooks, reading that article from Hitsong Deconstructed, it seems that they consider nearly every part of the vocal to be a hook, Paul.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's hook after hook after hook. I think we said this last time, but it seems to be a very common theme.
Well, hooks sell songs. So if you've got a song that is laden in them, you're going to have a radio friendly track. And there's not a throwaway moment in that regard.
Interestingly, I think they managed the hooks extremely well, because throughout the track, even though there's so much going on, even though it's hook after hook, they still manage the tension and release through the whole track. And I think that's what keeps the energy, keeps the interest. There's the obvious dead stop before the second, what I'm going to call verse, comes in, where just everything stops. Wait a minute, and there is a dead stop. But also throughout the whole track, it's up and down. Lots of fast delivery lyrics, then followed by a sort of chill out bit.
Which they more, at least two occasions I can think of, probably more, they use that very good pop trick of having a lyrical reference to the musicality that's about to happen. If we take an example away from this song, like High and Dry by Radiohead, Don't Leave Me High, and then he sings the high note on the word high. There is a clever word for that, and it escapes me at the moment. So on this,
prosody?
It could be that. I'm not going to... I can't remember, but it is a very, very common songwriting trick to have something referencing what you're doing musically in the lyric. And as you say there, wait a minute, and there's a pause. There we go. And there's the kiss myself, I'm too pretty, followed by a kissing sound on the microphone. It's cheeky, and it's, you say somewhat obvious, but if it was that obvious, everyone would be doing it all the time. But it raises a smile, and it becomes a one-time shot hook for that.
You've also got the "Don't believe me, just watch" bit, and then it goes into instrumental, giving you time to do a bit of strutting around. So
yeah, it's almost cueing.
Well.
Yeah,
yeah,
great point. It's cueing the time to strut.
Yeah,
which we all do so well, I'm sure, all four of us.
But I think those things. There was an interesting discussion on the forum about the difference between songwriting and songcraft, and I think the areas we're highlighting are very, very much the craft side of it, and whether you see that as a skill or cynical, but it works.
Well, it's been done since the beginning of pop music. So if you can do it well and you can make it sound like it is part of the song rather than something you've shoehorned in, then I think the audience are going to enjoy it. So I'm a big fan if it's done well.
Yeah.
Not easy to do, I think.
No, if it was easy to do, we'd all be doing it.
Yeah.
In fact, I was listening to an interview with Mark Ronson. Apparently, making this record come in on time and on budget was so stressful that he passed out at one point.
Yeah, it took him 8 months, I think, to chase Bruno around on tour to get it done.
Something ridiculous. Yeah, when he finally got him in the studio, he couldn't get a take that he liked of that guitar line, and it just drove him over the edge.
So lyrically, it's got a very strong theme of partying, living it up, the boasting, that whole, and the video complements it perfectly. I think it's a cracking video.
Yeah,
And
I mean, from a personal point of view, moving away from the statistics, does this song stand out for you as one of your favourites for a while, Paul?
Oh, absolutely. On first listen, it was an obvious. I mean, a Bruno fan anyway, but first listen, that's a hit.
I was just going to say on the first listen thing that, of course, they used it on X Factor, didn't they? And how often does an X Factor contestant sing a song that you've never heard before? And yet it worked brilliantly.
It's funny you should mention that, because I happened to see that performance and I remember thinking, is this that song that everyone's raving about? I can't see what's so great about it. It wasn't until I heard Bruno Mars and Mark Ronson doing the original version that it twigged, oh, hang on, yeah, no, this is absolute class.
And Uptown Funk appears 29 times in the song.
So it's using its
How does
titular
that
thing
compare
there.
with other hit songs then, Boydie?
Oh, I'd have to. I'm not going to sit and count them all, but
I think
it's a lot.
Well, you say that, but something like "Shake It Off" must have said "Shake It Off" at least a few dozen times, if not more. So I think
more interested. Sorry, James.
I was just going to say I can imagine it being a common thing that the hook line coming off the title, "Use a Lot," is going to be there with these big mega songs, these mega hits.
I think what really interests me about it is how different it is. It may, on paper, have all the essential ingredients for a hit song, but it stands out a mile compared to the other songs that I've heard recently on the radio. And I don't think it's just because they've kind of brought back a little bit of Princey funk.
I think there's a certain braveness to it. in that it doesn't follow obvious formulas, and it is grabbing lots of components in a hodgepodge way that works. Whereas that it could have fallen flat if it wasn't. Maybe that's part of Ronson's deal with having to really nail this. Maybe when it wasn't quite fully cooked in the studio, he was worried about it coming across as a pastiche. So he had to really nail the hooks and nail that modern feel against the retro references to make sure that it does become something, as you say, Anthony, that is unique.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm the same way. It's not a style of music that I'll go out of my way to listen to, but it's absolutely brilliant. I absolutely love the track. So
just one lyric thing I wanted to pull out. The everyone raves about, lyrics should find new ways of saying the old things, and I just thought the line "too hot, make a dragon want to retire, man" to rhyme with fireman was pretty cool.
It does have an air of the hip hop artists finding a clever lyrical twist. Artists like Outkast do that for me, where they'll say a seemingly throwaway line would actually sit back, and as you've said, Paul, it's kind of pretty genius. It's a modern
Polaroid picture.
That was one, yeah. And if you can find a way of doing that, and also having it make sense straight away, you don't have to unravel it. You hear it once and you go, "Oh, that's a clever metaphor right there." Brilliant. So I think we should move on from there. Thank you very much for that, Paul. That was very interesting. And for those of you that know that song, hopefully we've enlightened you a little bit on how we see it and how the industry sees it there from Hit Songs Deconstructed. And
Shake It Off appears 36 times within the song.
I said a few dozen. I should have said 3 dozen and been straight on there.
Hang on.
Awesome. Right, so let's move on to our featured discussion for this week. Now, last week we talked about songwriting in the community and how we each use websites and social media and other songwriters around us to influence and inflect upon our songwriting. This week we're actually going to go back a stage and we're going to talk about how we write songs. This is a question that often comes up on the forum, and I'm sure you guys will find as well in day-to-day life when you tell people that you are a songwriter. Probably the question I'm asked the most is, how do you write songs? Where do songs come from? So obviously, for those of you listening that are songwriters, this should be an interesting conversation for you to hear how other songwriters go about the process. And those of you listening that are into music but haven't written at all and maybe are interested in the process, hopefully should get some hints on how songs come to be effectively. Before we go into this, out of everyone here, who writes entirely by themselves and who writes as a collaboration method there? Becky, I'm sure you've done both of those. Is that correct?
Yeah, cool. Mainly on my own, but yeah, some collaborations as well, which have been good fun.
Well, this month, many collaborations while you were in Europe, in fact.
Yeah.
International
collaborations.
Yeah.
Paul, yourself, do you write solely by yourself?
Mainly on my own, but collaborations as well. So it's probably about 70-30.
And Anthony?
Yeah, almost exclusively on my own. The only other person I've written a whole song with is my wife.
There we go. Keeping it in the family. Lovely.
Beautiful.
And myself is, again, pretty much entirely just me. But obviously my day job as a producer, and I have done some commissions as well, but that's a different kettle of fish, so we'll leave that one to the wayside for now. I'll go first on this just to get the ball rolling. The simple answer is there is no simple answer, and I'm sure the three of you are going to agree with me here. I don't have a set method on how I sit down and write a song, and quite often I don't sit down to write a song. A few of the things that will get a song rolling. At university, one of my lecturers was very keen on the idea of doodling, he called it, where you'd sit with your instrument of choice and you just play around on a scale or with some chord sequences and just mess around basically until something twigs. And that probably for me is the golden ticket. It's when something twigs or when something hits you, as in, wait a minute, that could be something. Usually for me it's a melody line. So it will be a case of I'm playing around on the guitar and just a movement between two chords or between a movement on a scale between two chords will sound appealing. It'll be a case of that sounds pretty cool. Where can I go from here? And then more lines will appear. But I also find that can often happen with just a vocal. I've written quite a few songs in the car, in fact. I'm just humming along, just I suppose jazz artists would call it scatting, or just humming along lines, basically. And it's a case of I will make some sounds, and something interesting might come out of it, and then I'll start putting together a melody from that point. So for me, it's always a tiny little snippet of something which I could hear as part of a song, and then I build the song upwards from that snippet. And if that snippet happens to have a line or a few words which fit neatly into that snippet, then I can often get my lyrical feel for the song from that. But what I don't do very often is sit down with a set of lyrics I've already written and just try and put a melody on top of it. I've done that once or twice. I've got a track, Let Me Know, which is basically a poem, which I then put to some chords over the top, and the melody came from it. But yeah, for me, usually it's a tiny little motif which will then build into a song, and it could be the first line of the song, as was mentioned with the Becky, would you say with the Mark Ronson that it was actually Paul? Sorry, you said that it was the first line of that song that kind of spurred the rest of the track.
Yeah,
I've done that where it's the first line of a track, or I've done it where it's the chorus line, or just a throwaway part of the middle eight. I don't know where it's going to be, but it's something that when I'm writing a song. And the last thing to say is that I'm not particularly good at forcing myself into writing. Sometimes last week I was rehearsing up for a gig and just messing around with my loop pedal. Just hitting a few notes sounded pretty cool, and half an hour later I'd written the chorus. I didn't intend to, it just kind of happened. And I think that there's something to be said for that. For a lot of artists, just have to wait for that moment where something comes to you, and it can come from absolutely anything you're doing on an instrument or away from an instrument. So that's my ramblings to start you off. Who wants to go next? Anyone want to jump in?
well, it was interesting you said snippets, because that's what I'd written down. Snippets, come up with snippets, and then it's putting them together, especially lyrical bits go into a hook book in my phone. And
oh yes, you've told
me
about your hook book before.
Yes, that's a file.
Tell us
in my
about
phone.
the hook book.
Well, it's just a file in my phone. When you hear something on the radio, or you hear a conversation or an overheard thing, or read something, just think, it'd make an awesome, mainly titles, but also, if little lyrics come and they gradually get put together to form verses or choruses, and that's kind of how my lyrics start.
How do you know when something is hooky enough to go in the hook book?
It's just everything goes in, never screen going in, but it's just when you hear something, you just think, oh God, that'd make an awesome title. In it goes.
Well, it's a couple of things. I remember Tom York, as an interviewer, saying that whenever he had an idea for a song, he would always sit and finish it, and if it wasn't finished within half an hour or so, he'd just give up. And if it wasn't strong enough an idea and good enough I think with Radiohead the word hook might be a loose term. By the way, a huge Radiohead fan, that wasn't a slur there. But you know what I mean. And the other part was, I think it might have been Paul McCartney who said that if he was writing a song and he came back to it next day and he couldn't remember how it went, probably wasn't worth keeping. Mm-hmm. And that would make sense for a pop writer.
I almost live by that, but I don't agree with Tom York. Generally, if the music's strong, I would expect to be able to remember it, and if I can't, I'm happy to then allow myself it wasn't as good as I thought it was. But lyrically, once I've got the harmonic and melodic and rhythmic structure in place, normally I'll have a song mapped out in my head musically before I've written more than half a verse. But once I've got it and I like it, I'll then be prepared to spend months on the lyrics if I still believe in it.
So are you agreeing with me and perhaps Paul there, although we did cut you off there, Paul, that a snippet, and I mean, you're talking about snippets as in ideas of hook lines that could be. I was talking it as an hook line that exists. It's just a few notes and maybe some words that go with it, and from that an entire song will appear. Do you go to that ethos as well, Anthony? Or do you find it's more substantial parts of a song before you get to map the whole thing out?
haven't really got a method, but I suppose what happens most often is I'll be humming or playing the piano or the guitar, and I'll get a feel for something. A melody will appear, a chord progression will appear, and I will just kind of busk it until it forms into two parts that work together, sometimes three. And then generally, as I kind of play with it over the course of 10 minutes or 3 hours, I'll realize here's a verse, here's a chorus, here's a midsection, or this song doesn't have a chorus, or whatever. At which point, then I spend an indeterminate amount of time looking at a blank page.
So you're in the doodling camp, effectively. You
Yeah.
will play around on ideas that come to you, and then play around with them and doodle with them until something more substantial appears.
And yeah, unless that was one of those songs where you're doing the washing up and suddenly you think, oh, this tune and these words have appeared in my head, and I think they might be a song, so I better go upstairs and write it, and it kind of falls out.
So we've all had that,
fully
yes?
formed.
Yeah. I'll put my hands up and, okay, I'll ask everyone else, but also, has anyone had the thing where they've had to play a song to someone and go, does this exist? Have I heard this? Because I have done that a few times when I've written a song and I've had to play just maybe a verse and a chorus to someone, my housemate or a family member or someone floating around the studio. Have I nicked this off the radio subconsciously? And so far I haven't, to my knowledge, but you do get to worry about that because sometimes melodies kind of just appear fully formed. Is that something that everyone's had then?
Yep.
Anthony? Paul?
Yeah, absolutely.
Becky?
Not so much, I don't think. But I do kind of use other songs consciously as a not necessarily a starting point, but something to help me along the way. And then when I get to the end of writing my song, I have to think, have I done enough to make this my song and not just be a copy? And that's quite a difficult one to decide sometimes. Then I need other people's opinions then to help me out with that.
I'm going to jump in here because there was a thread on the forum quite recently, and I remembered it with regards to this conversation because it was quite pertinent to it, that someone was suggesting that a good way to learn to write songs would be to grab an existing melody, change a few notes around, and then go from there. I don't know if I like that. Guys, what do you think?
Not in that way. I think that there's an established thing called ghostwriting where you can use the structure and some of the ideas and flavours, but I wouldn't go as far as sort of copying the melody and just tweaking bits of it. I think you could end up with the ghost remaining, but the idea is you sort of ghost write to the structure, the tempo, maybe some of the chords, but I'd say the melody's a step too far. And the lyrics as well.
I would agree with that. I'm much more a fan of what I call the osmosis approach. If you hear a great song, sit down and learn it, and do that with as many songs as you can, and over time those kind of structures, ideas, lyrics, melodies will percolate into your subconscious, into something that's yours.
Yeah, whichever instrument you choose. For me it was guitar, and I think that's similar for a few of us here. If you learn Beatles songs, Oasis songs, Blur songs, I'm going for what I learned when I started guitar, stereophonics. You just learn the movements around the fretboard they use, and then they become part of the way you play. And then if the more influences you can have, the more ways you move around the fretboard or around your instrument of choice, and the more ways you're going to find that you can put your own stuff together. So yeah, I do fully agree that as a writer, you should always be picking up cover versions and learning songs that you haven't written to not pinch ideas from directly, but just expand to
build your vocabulary, basically.
Exactly. In the same way that an author will read huge number of books, not to rip off the other authors. It's to get an idea of how things can be done, and that's what songwriters need to do. Songwriters, there's a reason why with this podcast, I wanted the first thing we did each week, each podcast, to be a now listening discussion, because it's so important what's going into your ears, how that influences what comes out of your instruments going down the line.
I absolutely agree.
Cool. Becky, do you want to jump in with some ideas how you get off the ground then?
Yeah, sure. I think I often, when I get to the end of a song, I kind of look back and think, how on earth did that happen? So I'm not sure that I've got anything particularly enlightening to tell people, but I tend to be lyrics first. I tend to there's kind of half and half, having a complete lyric and then finding some music for it, and half having I don't know, what might end up a verse or what might end up a chorus, or it could be anything, and then going to melody, and then writing more lyrics, and then going to the rest of the instrumentation and stuff. Sometimes I'll come up with the melody idea that just comes from somewhere, don't know where, and build it up from there. And sometimes I'll have been listening to another song, as I said earlier, and thought, I really like that chord progression, I'll borrow that for these lyrics, and a new melody is going to come out of it somehow. But as I'm not an instrumentalist, other than singing, I find the building up of the song quite a laboured process. One that I enjoy, but slow and laboured. Doing it all through the computer. So yeah.
I think you're not alone, Becky. I mean, even though I can play, the building up of the song is a pretty laboured process for me.
Yeah.
Kind of 80% of the time, I'll spend hours and hours playing through what I've got, looking for that little detail that's missing, that lyric that's missing, the word that's missing, whatever it is that is making me feel that the song isn't finished. I kind of let the song finish itself, no matter how long it takes. I kind of don't mind that. It sort of satisfies a kind of really nitpicky part of my personality.
Yeah, I just I think perhaps it was going on this songwriter retreat where most people there were acoustic artists, and most of them really, really good guitarists, and so they can just, as you were saying earlier, do the doodling, and something quickly comes out of it, and I kind of don't have that facility. So,
well, I will say though, Becky, you do, because you effectively do vocal doodling. You will just mess around there, and there's something to be said about, I've got a few notes here to jump into, and one of them is that the limitations of an instrument such as vocal is similar to the limitations of, say, a woodwind instrument, insofar as you can only have one note at a time. Whereas with polyphonic instruments, you can go straight into chords. Whereas, I mean, Paul, you're like this, is that with the vocal, obviously, especially in a pop song or most popular styles of music, it is the forefront instrument. If that's where you write the body of the song, then you've got that bit up front, and if you're doodling on a vocal line, then the song will appear around it. And I've written many songs where I've written the entire song and I can sing it to you from just the lyric sheet. I don't know what the chords are yet, and I have to work backwards to find the chords, and often those turn out to be the stronger melodies, the more immediate pop songs, because you've written with only the vocal in mind. Whereas these fantastic guitarists, I mean, we all know what it's like when we hear songs, and it's often a discussion on the forum where people talk about the widdly guitarists, and I'm in awe of guitarists that can play hemi, demi, semi-quavers up and down the fretboard, but I can only take so much of it because it's not a song to me, it's instrumentation. And artists like Steve Vai who can do that, I will absolutely enjoy listening to, but I won't go out of my way to dive into their catalogue because it's not what I'm looking for in a song. So the limitations of just having, as you say, not having an instrument actually can be a strength that you've got there. I mean, Paul, from a pop writing point of view, you've been looking at more audio hooks that aren't necessarily even tonal. So that's two sides of a story there. You've got the pop hooks which are coming in on the vocal, and then parts of the track which aren't even technically tonal, they're more rhythmic or just even swooshes and hits and stuff. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, it's more interesting what you said the other way. I fell into the trap of building up these really elaborate backing tracks, for want of a better word, and then trying to fit a melody on top with a almost completed track. And my sort of eureka moments were sort of listening to how some of the big pop acts do it, and it's very simple. So I now tend to just get the groove and the vibe laid down with drums, maybe a bit of bass, but then the vocal, and try and get the vocal on as soon as.
Yeah, with instrumental music, because it it can go in so many places. Polyphonic music can go so far that you almost write yourself out of a clear melody line. There's too much going on. You're not in the world of the hook line or in the world of the simple vocal anymore. And for what many people listening to this and the 4 people on this podcast do, we look for songs that have that top line that is forward and engaging. So yeah, you stepping back from that was quite recent, wasn't it? The last couple of years?
I'd say even sooner than that. More recent than that.
Fascinating. Now, I've got one more note here before anyone else jumps in with their final thoughts. One thing that was suggested to me is writing on an unfamiliar instrument, which is kind of the antithesis of what I've just been saying, of sticking to your strengths and sticking to a vocal line and sticking to just having that forward. I've actually recently put out a track which is on my new album, and it's the first track I've ever written on a piano. And I'm not a pianist. I know where the notes are and I can play simple lines, but I'm not a piano player by any stretch of the imagination. And I wrote a song on the piano, and the chords, I still don't know what they are. I haven't actually sat down and worked them out. But because it's unfamiliar territory, the argument is that maybe I would go somewhere that I wouldn't go using a guitar. So does anyone else have any experience of putting themselves blindly on the instrument and seeing what comes out?
Completely agree with that. Done the same with keyboards, just to get for melody lines, obviously not so much for chords and elaborate arrangements, but certainly for a melody line. Get out of your boxes and your scales if you're a guitarist, or your patterns on a piano. Yeah,
and you just hit notes, and then you might find a melody which you wouldn't find on a guitar because you know where the scales are on a guitar. So you're not going to go to a really interesting I'm trying to think of an interesting mode. You're not going to put in a Lydian change without really thinking about doing so, whereas you might do it by accident on a piano whilst humming along, and then you've got a really interesting scale or a melody line which you wouldn't have found using your standard methods. So,
I think that's true at the doodling stage, and maybe I'm on my own here, but once I've got the beginnings of something, generally I will kind of already know what harmonic changes are going to come along. I can hear them as I can imagine the melody. So at that point, whatever instrument I happen to be playing becomes kind of irrelevant. It's just at that sort of almost daydream exploration stage that I find it makes a difference. And even then, it only makes a difference if you haven't yet established patterns on that new instrument. Because as I became better on the piano, I'm kind of falling into predictable patterns that I'm now struggling to get out of.
Yeah. It wasn't, the song that I mentioned for myself there, I ended up putting the whole thing on piano, but believe me, there were coloured sticker tapes all over the piano to lead my fingers, and I took many a take to get the actual album recording version down. But I could have stepped away with the melody line I'd written, just a top line, and put it onto a guitar. But I didn't. Just on that occasion, I liked how it was sounding. And it is very simple. Someone mentioned Alanis Morissette earlier, and she's another artist who isn't a particularly strong guitarist or pianist, but will find lead lines on both of those instruments and let the band take it from there. And on her second album, there's quite a few songs which are just 4 notes that repeat. I'm guessing many of us know Uninvited, which became a very big dance track from Freemasons a few years ago. And that uses a very kind of haunting piano movement with a semitone switch in there at one point. And that's the kind of thing which a trained pianist probably wouldn't go to, because it's simple and it's around an odd chord to open the song on. But she just doodled that, and that became the entire track. I've actually got a demo version of that from the Thank You single, which is the lead single off of that album. And it's just 2 chords on the piano for each verse, and it's just haunting because it's a very strange movement that she's gone to. So yeah, I'm a big advocate of putting yourself into an instrument that you don't know about and seeing what comes out effectively. But do, as Paul said, keep it simple, and then think about building the track thereafter, and in a similar way to what you're mentioning there. So
yeah, I think it'd be really interesting to maybe strip it down to writing on the bass with the vocal. So you kind of imply the harmony at the bottom and the rhythm, and then your vocal melody,
Yep.
and then fill in the rest. I might try that. So watch this space.
There we go. Something for the future there. Becky, one quick question for you. You mentioned that you don't play. You're not particularly an instrumentalist there, and you generally do ideas from your vocal. Do you find that sometimes you sit at a piano or with a guitar and just play something, even if you don't know what it is, and see what comes out to lead you somewhere?
No.
Okay.
That's a short answer.
Is that something you consider, though? Because, I mean, as I say, me and Paul we don't play piano, but we've just sat at a piano hitting keys, and then sometimes something will appear.
I mean, I could do that with a piano, and it wouldn't be a total waste of time. It would be a complete waste of time if I tried that on the guitar.
It's less immediate pick up and play instrument. But what I did want to ask then is, you mentioned earlier with your retreats that you've been on, that there are certain methods of writing which you've been exposed to in the last few during that week there. Would you like to share any of those which you're going to try going forward?
Yeah, sure. So there were 5 different days on which we wrote, and we were given a different way of approaching the song each day. I think 3 of the days kind of focused on lyrics, and one of them was just basically we're given a topic and then asked to flow write. So just literally write down everything that comes into your head without stopping, without thinking too much. And then in your partnership, you would essentially kind of compare notes and see what other ideas came from that, and gradually build up a kind of a picture of ideas, and then start homing in on the ones that really appeal to you, and then use that to build up a song. That was on the first day, and was the one that for me worked least well, and I think that's as much because it was the first day and it was still very daunting at that point as anything else. We had another one where we had to go out into the town and listen for rhythms, which actually resulted in a really cool song, I think. But the actual listening for rhythms bit was difficult because kind of the rhythms that come out of nature are quite random.
Who was that?
That was me, sorry.
Good.
What else was there? Well, there was kind of going out and finding an interesting looking person and observing them, and kind of writing down ideas of anything that came into your head relating to the person. That resulted in quite a fun song. Another one was quite strange, actually. The idea was that you, in your partnership, go out and walk in silence together for about 20 minutes. You don't say a word to each other. You don't discuss what you're thinking about. You just walk. And then after you've done that for 20 minutes, you start doing this flow writing thing. So just any thoughts and ideas that have come into your head from the walking around, whatever you've observed while you've been walking or felt or whatever, you write down, and then again do the comparing notes and start homing in on interesting ideas. So yeah, they were a few of the ones that we did.
I like the music as anthropology argument you had there with the looking at a person and writing a song from it, because I think we've all done that. I've definitely written songs about people, and when I get an idea, I frame a song around this person in my life. So to do it for a stranger is an interesting idea. But I can think of a few songs from artists I love who have done exactly that. So that's a proven technique there. Yeah, some really interesting ideas. I'm sure there's a scientist who, it might have been Darwin, but don't quote me on that. He used to walk around his garden in circles. Does anyone know this story?
No.
And it was just used to pace in silence around his grounds. I think it was some fairly affluent English scientists they tended to be. And he would just wait for ideas and inspiration to come to him, just walking in silence. So that's a known method for many people as far as influence and the eureka moment is concerned. Over my words
I suppose it's kind of just giving your time and space to allow your brain to go into a creative mode.
Yeah, let the synapse.
I think there's a real shortage of actual silence in the way we live at the moment, so it's probably quite a valuable method. But it's also the direct opposite of what you called flow writing, which I know as free writing. And I just thought it'd be worth throwing in there. A friend of mine who's really keen on writing gave me this book a while back by Natalie Goldberg, and it's called Writing Down the Bones. And if you're interested in taking this kind of put the pen on the paper and don't take it off until you've filled, either 20 minutes or 2 sides or whatever your goal is, then you should definitely check this book out. It's a really nice companion to letting yourself out in a kind of steady fashion onto the page to see what's there, as both a writing and just kind of personal insight exercise.
That sounds great.
It is, yeah. It's a really good book. You should check it out.
Yeah.
Right, so just wrapping that conversation up, obviously it seems like there's a lot of good ideas bouncing around here, and for those on the forum, please do join us on the thread that's going to be set up and put your opinions forward. We want this conversation to go forward. Naturally, there is no golden bullet here. There is no direct answer to the question, but hopefully there's some ideas which have twigged and kind of percolated there to get your synapses firing for some ideas there. So Becky, this week there is a competition rolling on the forum which they've asked us to plug. So could you please tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's being organised by Neil C. and Paul Ski on the forum. And thanks for your email, Neil. And yeah, very happy to put in a little plug for the competition. If anyone's interested in submitting a song, the theme is dreams. But other than that, there are no rules about what the song could be. It's open to all forum members, could be solo effort or collaboration. It's all completely up to you. And if you're interested, have a look on the forum and find the relevant thread in the competition section.
Those competitions tend to be very popular, so it's always a very, very engaging way of writing as well. There's some amazing songs that have come out of that over the last few years of being on the forum, so do check that out. Thank you, Becky.
Great, thank you.
So that's going to come towards the end of our podcast. Thank you all for listening. We're going to quickly go around and do some plugs for firstly ourselves. If we are now on iTunes, you can find us by going to iTunes on the podcast app and searching for Songwriter Select. You will find us right there. Do please download us, subscribe, and if you're enjoying what you're listening to, do please leave us a review. It's very useful, especially in the early stages of a podcast, to get the word spread there. You can email us at songwriterselect@gmail.com, or you can find us on Twitter at swselectpodcast or facebook.com/songwriterselect. We'll go around and do our individual plugs. You can find me online. I am James Nighthawk. You can find me on Twitter, SoundCloud, Facebook, etc. All on that name, nice and easy for you. Becky, how can we find you? You did mention it earlier, but do repeat for us.
Sure, I'm on SoundCloud as Becky Lucy Thomas, or Twitter as Becky Lucy Music.
Brilliant. Anthony, how can we find you?
You can find me on Twitter. It's Anthony Laneism, and that's the same on Facebook. But also, the forum's my baby, so don't forget to check it out, songwriterforum.co.uk. We will see you all there, yes. And Paul, where can we find you?
The forum that we've been referring to, as Tone said, is the songwriterforum.co.uk, and there is Boydie, that's Boydie. Also SoundCloud, Boydie Music, one word, and Twitter, Boydie Music.
Fantastic. That wraps us up for this week. Thank you all very much for listening. Do tell your friends if you enjoyed what you're listening to there, any musical comrades you've got in your life. Other than that, we will see you in a few weeks' time for our next episode. Thank you all for listening, and thank you, Paul, Anthony, and Becky, for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes. See you guys. I'll catch you soon. Bye-bye.